Good. Shall we start? Okay, ready to go live when you are, sir? Do you want me to wait for a few seconds? Lovely. Well, welcome everybody, those joining us online as well as those joining us in the room. Very, very nice to see you all. Should we pray? It's always a good start, isn't it? Might as well start getting it right, haven't we? if it goes wrong afterwards. So let's pray, shall we? Lord. Well, Lord, thank you for another opportunity just to, begin to think how we can be a little bit more effective at sharing our faith with our friends, with our family members, our work colleagues, acquaintances, or people that we've yet to get to know, Lord. Maybe people that we'll share our faith with in the future. Lord, we pray that as we think about that today, you would, really inspire us and encourage us, Lord. Put within us a new sense and a renewed sense of excitement and belief that we can be used by you to help people on their journey. Amen. Amen. Well, it's great to be here with you today. I'm not sure who's been to the previous sessions or not. We won't take a register, don't worry. But let me just explain a few brief things about the books which I bring each time with me. So there's some books out there, one called Big Yes, Little Yes, Healthy Maybe, a new framework for evangelism, which helps us to understand the journey by which a person comes to faith and how, it is important to give opportunities for people to make a decision, but actually that's a part of the person's journey. And sometimes if we just focus on that, we can end up being a bit disheartened or discouraged because the person's not quite at the place where they're ready to make that decision, whereas we certainly historically have kind of put our eggs in that decision basket. And so the book explores as a study guide. It's obvious what the study guide is. It says study guide on it. So I think that's, I know, you can see why they brought me in, can't you? And also there's a couple of, 3 books in particular that are aimed at different stages of a person's journey. So there's the book that I was showing this morning, The Journeys for people who have said yes to God or are just almost there. You know, when you meet people that they're almost there and they might be reading the Bible or even praying, but they've not quite made a commitment yet. And so that book's useful for that. Then there's another book called Look Closer, which is for the little yes people to investigate and explore the Christian faith. It's basically the gospel, but really kind of explored and unpacked and applied. And then Is It Possible is what I call healthy maybe people. So that's to encourage people to become open-minded, particularly for the atheists who have decided there is no God. It just nudges them to consider that there could be a God, and that's the intended sort of win, as well as people who I'm sure you've met people that have decided Christianity isn't for them, but they've never really looked into it. That book's aimed at that as well. So those are books there. And then a couple of books that I'll mention today, because these relate particularly to what we're going to be having a little chat about this afternoon. So 2 books. One, a little book called Faith Book, Ignore the Price on the Back. Didn't quite get the pricing right on that, so it's not £4, it's £3. And ignore the price on the menu, the price list, because that was an error. It's £3, okay? And that's really a guide to sharing your faith with other faiths, in as much as I think so often when it comes to sharing your faith with other faiths, we can in the church have had a bit of an unhelpful attitude towards it. We can almost, if we're not careful, see people from a different faith almost as an enemy. I don't mean literally an enemy, but actually they're not. They're people who have got a genuine desire to follow God, to find out about God. Now, you and I, we know that Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. But I think we can be a bit too dismissive of people who have found some sense of spiritual fulfillment in another faith. And so it encourages us to be respectful towards those people, but it also gives us a whole bunch of information as to help us to understand where some of the other faiths are coming from. And it looks particularly at, I'll tell you what the religions are that it looks at. It's the key ones really that you're going to meet in and around the UK. So it's Buddhism, Christadelphian, Christian Science, Hare Krishna, Hinduism, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses, Judaism, Mormons, New Age, Scientology, Sikhism, and the last one, that's two, spiritualism and Wiccan/paganism. And so that covers quite a breadth. It's the key kind of cult sects and religions that you'll find around the UK. And it looks at where they're from, where they were established, so it helps you to get to know them a little bit. But it looks at what they believe about salvation, for example, about heaven, about the afterlife, what they believe about Jesus, etc. So it's a really practical guide to sharing your faith with other faiths. And then just gives you a little bit of, some tools on how you can do that. So for example, I talk about, you know the scripture where Jesus is having a conversation with Simon Peter and he says to him, who do people say I am? Simon Peter says, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're this person or that person. And then Jesus says to them, okay, never mind what they say. This is the Mark Greenwood version, by the way. Okay, who do you say I am? Simon Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to him, blessed are you, Simon Peter, because this has not been revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I'm sure you're familiar with that verse. It's my limited scholarly opinion that the church was founded at that moment in time in terms of theologically. So the church is founded upon the fact that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. So it comes as no surprise to me that every religion and cult and sect is founded on the antithesis of that, if that makes sense. So what I think is a really good equipping tool is to strengthen up our ability to talk about the birth, life, death, and resurrection, and the objections about that. So, for example, the virgin birth. So that's it's not an in-depth look at any one particular book. It's just a general grounding for. It's not an in-depth analysis of any one particular faith, not book. Sorry, it's a general grounding just to get you going, to kind of equip you across the board. So that's faith book, and then this book here is answering tricky questions. We're going to look at this stuff today, but this book will give you, it's a starter for 10. It gets you going with the most frequently asked questions and how you can start just to get yourself in a better place to answer those questions. I think they're both written by me and they're both available, and if you have only got a card, I can take card payment. I can even take phone payment these days. I don't mean you give me your phone, by the way. I mean you're contactless. I could take all of that. So that's a little bit about the books, and then now we're going to launch into looking at tricky questions. What we'll do is we'll have a break after a little while, then you can get a hot tasty beverage, and then we'll come back and we'll be done. We've tended to get sort of finished by 2:30 at the latest, I think. Was that time what we aimed for, Keith? I can't quite remember. I'll do whatever you tell me, obviously, but I think that's about where we were going for. By the way, any questions that you've got to do with what we're chatting about, or just to do with about evangelism generally, or anything to do with the mission. We're going to have a Q&A session as part of the next time I'm here, just to any questions that there might be about the sort of mission weekend as we get nearer to that. But please feel absolutely free to ask any questions. Is that okay? Fab. Lovely, lovely, lovely. I'm just going to make sure that my do-free is not working. Okay, my doobry stopped working. Never mind. Do you think somebody might be able to advance the slide for me? I'm not quite sure why it's suddenly stopped working on me. It should be fairly obvious if you press the first one just to make sure we're on the... it's doing the spinning wheel of death look. It's probably going to keep doing that for a while now. Yeah. It'll certainly stop it doing that. Don't worry, you can storm out now because the slides are not working. So we'll do without them, and I'll, can you see that? Does that help? Don't worry about it. They've updated my software, and it's been a pain ever since. Just leave it as it is, and it'll be fine. But alas, no, that's absolutely fine, not a problem. Okay, so a number of years ago, I was many years ago now. It's like when you I don't know if you've ever done this where you're saying a number of years ago and you've said that for about 25 years. So the thing now becomes a distant memory. But a number of years ago, I was doing some street evangelism. I'd not long been a Christian. I wasn't brought up in a Christian home. We became a Christian through door-to-door evangelism, my family and I. And I was 12 years old, so I wasn't brought up in the church. And when I was sort of 17, just a few days for my 18th birthday, that's when I went out and started doing my training in evangelism. And I went into full-time evangelism. That was in 1988. And so I was quite new to the Christian faith. There's lots of things I didn't. I'm not as new to it now, but there's still lots of things I don't know. But I knew even less then. And I was in one of those conversations, and I don't know if you've ever been in those conversations where somebody's asking you a question, and you start to answer the question. But before you get anywhere near an explanation, they ask you another question. And so you sort of ignore that one now and start to answer this question. And then, before you get anywhere near finishing, they ask you another one. And you feel like you're hanging on to their coattails. Have you ever been in one of those situations? And it can be so frustrating and so annoying. Well, it was one of those type of situations. And I was getting really frustrated because, I was new to it all. I hadn't quite sussed out all the answers. So whenever people were asking me questions, I was feeling a little bit vulnerable anyway. And I was trying to give what little bit of an answer I could, but they weren't letting me. And so I was getting more and more frustrated. And then this gentleman asked me the question, why did Adam eat the apple? And so I said to him, actually, I believe what I said is, aha. It wasn't as if I'd got him, you know what I mean? I said, it wasn't an apple. He said, well, never mind what it was. He said, why did he do what he did? And I'm going, I don't know why he did what he wasn't there. So I said to him, I don't know. And I thought, I've got to get out of this somehow. I said, I tell you what, when I get to heaven, if he's there, I'll ask him. And the guy said to me, well, what happens if he's not in heaven, he's in hell? And I looked at the guy and said, well, then you can ask him. No, no, I've matured a lot more since then. You know what I mean? I wasn't, no, at the time I was really proud of the answer, if I'm really honest. I did go away with thank you. But, I've learned a lot since then, and you'll be pleased to know I've got a little bit better at handling tricky questions. But it kind of spurred me on because that conversation was reflective of quite a few conversations that I'd had before I went into full-time ministry. I was, full-time pay. We're all in full-time ministry, aren't we? But you know what I mean. I was a butcher, and I found myself I was in a Victorian market. There was loads of butchers' stalls, and And I found myself often in that place where we were having these conversations, and to varying degrees of satisfaction, I answered questions. But I did feel for a long time, and this just kind of highlighted it, I need to get better at that. And actually, I think that's the place for lots of people who are Christians. I think it's true to say the number one way we get into conversation about faith is when people ask us a question. It's not the only way, but often it's a way into conversation, isn't it? Oh, you're a Christian. What do you think about this? Or how can you believe? And so I thought, actually, if that's the number one way that we're going to get into conversation with people, then I need to prepare myself for it. I need to make sure that I'm that little bit better. I don't believe for 1 minute I have to be the font of all knowledge and the know-all. And actually, sometimes I think we can maybe come across a bit arrogantly, actually, if we're like that. So essentially, what I want to share with you this afternoon is how I kind of developed over my life and finding myself in all these circumstances and situations, how I kind of developed into a place where I feel quite relaxed actually now. I'm very, very confident. I don't say this out of any sense of arrogance, but I've debated atheistic professors in universities when I've done CU missions there, and it's not caused me any concern. And that's largely due to the fact that I've just thought about it a lot and discovered a number of things. One of which is I've not really come up against any new question that's caused me any problems. Most of the questions that we get asked are variations thereof of other questions. They've just got different clothing on. But it's not just about the objection, it's as much about the objector. So how we handle, I don't mean like that by the way, but how we handle the objection and the objector. So that's what I want to chat with you about today. And the spinning wheel of doom is still going on my MacBook, so we'll ignore that. So I came across a brilliant description of what it means to handle people's tricky questions. The posh word's apologetics. I'm sure you've heard of that, the word apologetics. If you haven't, apologetics it's not about developing the art of saying sorry, okay? Apologetics is, the Concise Evangelical Dictionary of Theology calls apologetics a systematic defense or justification of the divine origin and authority of the Christian faith. Now that's a mouthful in itself, isn't it? But the key thing I want to extract out of that phrase is, first of all, it's a defense. So hold that one. But it's a systematic defense. What does systematic mean? Systematic means we've thought about it, essentially. It means we haven't just thrown something out. When we find ourselves in an unexpected moment and the spotlight's on us and we throw out an answer that we haven't really thought through. So first of all, it's systematic. So we've thought it through. We've taken some time to think it through. But I do think it's a defense, not an attack, is really, really important. I think we're not trying to attack what somebody else believes. We're trying to defend what we believe. And I think that's important because actually, now, there are times when maybe an attack of what somebody else believes is appropriate. So, for example, in a debating situation, that might be, so it's more of an academic attack rather than a personal attack on. But I think, by and large, I think it's important more that we defend what we believe. Now, that doesn't mean that people reciprocate. It doesn't mean that people will not attack what we believe. But I think it's quite important that we just defend what we believe. And I think particularly if you're chatting with people from another faith, We need to be respectful. I'll mention a little bit more about that in a few moments' time. So for me, apologetics and handling these tricky questions, it's not about getting one-upmanship on somebody. It's about me just stepping back, being quite relaxed and saying, look, this is why I believe what I believe. And I actually think that the Bible instructs us to do that. 1 Peter 3:15, which is a scripture that is, I feel, in my humble scholarly opinion, that we so often misuse. So 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a hope for the reason that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Now, often people have said, we need to always be prepared to share our faith, to share the gospel with somebody, because 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, blah, 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 blah. But actually, the Greek word for answer is the word apologia, and you don't need a degree in Greek to work out that apologetics probably comes from the word apologia. And so actually what this verse is telling us to do is to always be in a place where you can give a systematic, thought-through defense or justification of the divine origin and authority of the Christian faith. In other words, always be prepared to give a really good answer when people ask tricky questions. That's what that verse is. Now, it is true that we should always be ready to share our faith. There's just other verses that we might use to substantiate that. And actually sharing the gospel and sharing our testimony can certainly be part of, and or arguably should be part of, giving this apologia. But I think we fall a little bit short of that verse and what it really means if we don't take time to think about the tricky questions that people ask us. So always be prepared to give an answer to everyone. Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? From whatever faith. Now, listen, a little bit of honesty. I'm not always at that place, okay? But I'm trying to get closer to it. I'm trying my best just to get myself more prepared. I'm constantly reading and constantly trying to understand so that I can get myself better equipped. So I think that's a really important thing. Another thing to consider, Mark 12:28 says this, noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked. And this is a really, really interesting verse. Here's Jesus. He's in a public place. There's an expert in the law who's observing Jesus. And Jesus is answering lots of questions. People are asking him lots of questions. And Jesus is answering those questions. And this expert in the law is watching and he's thinking, wow, he's giving some really good answers there. And then it says that noticing Jesus had given a good answer, he asked him, Jesus, which do you think is the greatest of all the commandments? Are you familiar with this verse, I'm sure? And Jesus goes on to answer him. So I just find this verse really fascinating because the question, which of all the commandments is the greatest, was like the hot potato of the day. Amongst the Jewish culture, every Jewish culture was influenced by a rabbi. Every rabbi was influenced by a particular rabbinic school they would have studied at. No difference really to theology colleges today. They tend to have like distinctives. And depending on which rabbinic school you were schooled at, you would have a different slant on which was the greatest commandment. So here's this guy thinking, wow, Jesus has given really good answers there. I wonder what Jesus' opinion as a rabbi, I wonder what his opinion is on the big questions. That's basically what's happening here. I want to suggest to you, by getting better at answering what might seem not very important questions, if we can get better at answering those questions, it's my experience that when it comes to the bigger questions that your friends have, they're more, and family members, they're more likely to come to you to get those questions. So a little bit of a survey. Who thinks, there's no deep theological significance to this, by the way, but I'm just interested to see what you think. So who thinks Adam, in the book of Genesis, who thinks Adam had a belly button? You see, it's deeply theological today, can't you? If you think Adam had a belly button, raise your hand. Okay. Some of you could have, maybe, yeah, maybe. Okay. Hands down. If you don't think Adam had a belly button, raise your hand. Okay. Oh, okay. Synergy there, synergy. If you're not sure whether Adam had a belly button, raise your hand. And if you're really not bothered whether Adam, that went up far too quick. Okay, so I know it's a bit of a random question, but work with me on this one. So I was chatting to a gentleman many years ago, probably around the same time as the other one who asked me a question about why Adam ate the apple. And we were having this conversation. And he said to me, Mark, could I ask you like a question I really need to know the answer to? It's been plaguing me. It's one that nobody's been able to give me a satisfactory answer to. So I'm bracing myself for like the suffering question. You would understand that, wouldn't you? He's going to come at me with the suffering question. So, you know, I'm kind of rehearsing the response that I've got ready for it. I said, yeah, go for it. He said, you know, Adam, I thought, oh, it's a different way to the suffering question, but I think I know where he's going to go. I think I can cope with that. I said, yeah. He said, did he have a belly button? And I'm not going to lie, I did exactly the same as you internally, but externally I was very professional. You'd have been proud of me. Inside I'm going, what? What? And I said to him, I said, I'm going to be honest with you. I said, I've never been asked that question before. And I'm going to be honest with you, I've never been asked it since, to be fair. And I said to him, but I could see, even though it was like, and I was quite immature, even though I was bemused by it, I could see for him it was quite important. So I just said to him, I said, look, I can see this is a really important question to you. So just give me a few moments, because I genuinely had never been asked it before. So I had a little thing, and I said to him, look, I've got no way of substantiating this. I've got no way of proving this. And I said, I could be completely wrong here, but I think I've got an answer, and I'll explain why I've concluded that in the short time that I did. I said, I don't think Adam had a belly button, and my only reason for that is because he wasn't born in natural means, natural ways. Does that make sense? So I said to him, that's all I can offer you, really. And he said to me two things. He said, first of all, he said, actually, I think that's probably quite sensible. He said, I want to thank you not for the answer that you've given, but the fact that you've given an answer. I said, oh, tell me more. And I've learned a lot in evangelism to ask lots of questions. Never just go straight in. Just try and solicit some information, because it informs you. So I said, tell me more about why you feel this way. And he said, well, Mark, I've got lots of friends who are Christians. He said, and I am interested in Christianity. So I don't ask the questions I ask because I want to trip people up. He said, I ask it because I have genuine questions, and I can't move on because of some of these questions. He said, and I know it seems such a small question. He said, and actually lots of the Christian friends I've asked have just laughed at me. He said, but you need to understand I'm genuinely looking for answers. He said, and they've often told me to read the Bible. And so when I've started reading the Bible, I've started where you start with every book at the beginning. He said, and whenever I've tried to read the Bible, I've always got to this bit in Genesis where it talks about the creation. I have so many questions around that, but one of the ones that I've had is, I wonder if Adam had a belly button. He said, and I know it's weird. He said, but I've actually become quite scandalized because people have treated my questions like almost disdainfully. I determined that day that I'll never, ever, ever And actually it's changed me internally now as well, that I'll never, ever, ever treat anybody's question as comedic or, of intellectual insignificance. Because actually, if a question's a question, it's a question, right? And unless it's a red herring, which we'll sort of visit, I've decided, unless I know, I'll just treat everybody's questions as really serious, because I'd rather treat somebody's question as sincere and serious and get it wrong than treat it as insincere and get it wrong because it was sincere. So it taught me a lot about the objection and the objector. And I've certainly experienced in my own personal evangelism with my friends that when I've given good answers to people, they've definitely come to me. And it's been really interesting in the last 2 years with lockdown. I've found now that some of my friends, they're asking the same questions they've always asked, but now they're willing to entertain my answer a little bit more and have conversations around my answer, whereas historically they would have maybe tried to combat, for want of a better phrase, my answer. So I think it's a really important thing, and it is as much about learning to handle the person asking the question as well as it is the question that they're asking. So how do we do it then? Well, I want to help you understand what's in my mind when I'm dealing with questions. When I was at school and did my maths lesson, and my daughters assure me this is still the case, my teacher used to say to me, Mark, make sure you show you're working out. Because even if you get the answer wrong, if I can see that you've understood the maths question, I'll give you some points for that because you've understood it, but you've just made an error somewhere. Does that make sense? And I think for me, when it comes to this whole area of dealing with tricky questions, I want people to see that I've worked this out. I want people to see that I've thought this through. Because even though they might disagree with my answer, they might think my answer's wrong, if I can show them I've thought this through and taken some time to really engage with it, then they give me brownie points, as it will. I get points. And that's so true for me. I've experienced that when I've shown these things, people haven't necessarily, agreed with my answers all the time, but what they have said is, oh gosh, I hadn't quite thought about it like that. Or, oh, you've thought about this a lot more than I've thought about it. And actually, by doing that, it can make people more open to the possibility of maybe what Mark said is true, maybe what Mark said is right, and maybe what I'm saying, yeah, I need to just visit that and think about that. So I think it's really important that we can take some time to think things through. And I think for a lot of people who are Christians, people who aren't Christians, a lot of us can just repeat what we've heard other people say. So when people say to you, well, of course, science has disproved it all, your average person in the street has heard somebody say that. And let's face it, on the TV, it's very one-sided, isn't it? I get so annoyed when the TV presents, because whether it's right or wrong, it's like, no, don't just say all the science proves, because that's just not true. and I get so frustrated. I want to kick the TV sometimes, because I think it's selling people a lie, basically. Let's be big enough, academically and intellectually. Let's be big enough to say, actually, there's certain science suggests that this is true, but there's a whole bunch of other science that says it's not. And I think when people make sweeping statements like that, it so annoys me. But I think as Christians, we can also do the same if we're not careful. So I'll give you a couple of examples as we go through these sessions, but I think we've got to make sure that we're not doing the same thing that everybody else is doing. So that for me is really, really important. So how do we do it? I think the first thing we need to do is when somebody asks a question, we need to inside think, right, is this question sincere or is it a red herring? That's the first thing that I try to kind of think through. And how do I do it? There's a couple of ways that I try to ascertain. First of all, is it in context with what we're talking about? So if, for example, we're talking about the book of Genesis or creation, which does happen in some instances, and my friend, the belly button guy, okay, let's say he asks the question, did Adam have a belly button? Well, if we're talking about Genesis or creation or that story, and he asks that question, there's a strong likelihood it's not a red herring. Do you understand what I mean by red herring, by the way? It's when somebody asks a question, not because they want to know the answer, but just because they're trying to sort of put us off the trail or trying to trip us up. If I'm talking about Jesus taking the punishment for the wrong of the whole world, and he says, yeah, but did Adam have a belly button? There's a good chance that that's a red herring because it's not in context with what we're talking about. The second thing I try to do is the person just firing questions at me and not giving me a chance to properly answer? So that with reference to the first gentleman that I told you with, why did Adam eat the apple? He was just firing questions at me. What do you do in those circumstances? Well, I do a number of things. I'm actually quite kind but firm. And so I'll actually say to somebody, I said, look, I'm really happy to answer all of your questions. No problem at all. Trying my best to give you an answer. But what I'm not going to do is give you a bit of an answer and then you ask me another one. So out of respect, if you can allow me to give an answer to you, and let's just look at this question, and then if you want to ask about the other, that's fine, we can do so. But I'm not just going to chase around after you giving part answers. I said that's of no value to anybody. So I'm quite firm, not nasty, but I'm not really here just to chase around after somebody. Does that make sense? And I think sometimes we've just got to be a little bit firm, sensitive, kind, generous, but firm nevertheless. And then the other approach that I have to, if somebody's asking me lots of questions, but I sometimes I'm not sure, is it genuine, is it sincere? I'm not quite sure. I'll often say in those circumstances, look, I'm happy to answer all or one of your questions, but you seem to have got lots of questions and we're not really looking at any one in particular. So I wonder whether I might ask you this question. If out of all the questions that you've got, if there was one question which I could give you a reasonable answer to, it would make you much more open to the possibility that there may be a God and that Christianity may be true. Which question would that be? So I don't say if I could give you a good answer, it'd make you become a Christian, because that'll close the conversation down. But also, actually, even if it didn't, if I did give a good answer and they were in a place where they couldn't respond to that, then they might feel a bit trapped. They might concede intellectual defeat and become a Christian. But you don't become a Christian by conceding intellectual defeat, do you? You become a Christian because you recognize your need of God and you realize you need him. And so I'm just really sensitive to not trapping people. For me, that's a really, really important thing. So having said that, if I still don't know whether it's sincere or red herring, as I alluded to earlier, I treat them all as sincere. The other thing is the tone. What's the tone? My mum used to always say to me that my tone belied what my voice was actually saying. So if I said one thing and I was coming across a bit stroppy, and I said, I'm not stroppy. She said, look at your tone. So I think the tone's quite helpful, isn't it? Is it an inquisitive, inquiring desiring tone, or does it feel like it's got a little bit of an edge to it? And I do believe often when there's an edge, sometimes there can be a little bit of anger underneath. Some of the most violently against atheists that are violently against Christianity, there's something often under there that when you dig around, it can be quite revealing. So what's the tone? So is it in context? Is the person just firing questions? What's the tone? But then the thing that I do then, so I've ascertained that. The thing that I do then is I want to question the question. Now, I don't mean like politicians do, and I don't mean reversing the question. So when somebody who's an atheist says to me, prove to me there's a God, I don't then say to them, prove to me there isn't. My mate thinks that's a really good approach. I think it's rubbish. Because all as we've done is we've just turned the tables. And dependent upon whether you're trying to have an academic game of tennis and win, or whether you're trying to journey with a person, if you're trying to genuinely journey with a person, be relational with them, then for me it's a poor response just to put the burden back on them. So they've asked the question, prove to me there's a God. So when I say question the question, I don't mean turn it back to them or anything like that. What I mean by that is I'll say to them, so let's say it's suffering, for example. Then the person asks me the question. So I'll do a couple of things. The first thing I'll do is I'll acknowledge their genuine question. So I'll say that's a really, really good question. And I said, to be honest with you, I've put quite a lot of thought into it because it's actually quite a challenging question. Let's face it, for those of us who are committed Christians, when you see some of the suffering that goes on in the world, it's hard, isn't it? And if you didn't find it hard and it didn't trigger some emotions and how does that all work with God? Even though theologically we've got a cupboard we can put it into, emotionally it gets you, doesn't it? It does get you. So I don't pretend to be somebody who's got all the answers, even though I've done a lot of thinking through on this and I'm confident with the answers academically that I can give. So I say to people, look, that's a really difficult question. I totally understand where you're coming from. It's one that I've put a huge amount of work into because for me as a Christian, I actually do believe that God's all-loving and all-powerful. And I do believe that there's all the suffering in the world. So those are two immovable points from me. So I've had to find, how do I hold those two things in tension? Where I said, for you, as somebody who's not a Christian, you can just go, oh, well, there's all the suffering in the world, so there's no tension because well, there's no God. There's no all-loving and all-powerful God. And I say to people, it's only a challenge when you make a statement about him being all-loving and all-powerful. Because if God is all-loving but not all-powerful, he might want to do something about it, but he can't. If he's all-powerful but not all-loving, he can do something about it, but there's no motive for him to do something about it. So it's only a challenge when you say that God's all-loving and all-powerful. And for me as a Christian, I believe both those elements. So that's why it presents a challenge, because both of those are immovable, they're immovable, aren't they, those 2 points? So how do I handle those two things together? So first of all, I acknowledge that it's a genuine question, and I try to show that I've thought this through, and that this is how I process that, this is how I handle it. So I try to show myself as a fellow human being who's on the journey, not, right, sit at my feet and let me teach you everything. So that's the first thing. Genuine question, acknowledge your own journey with that. And I have another little policy with evangelism in general. Before I find out what I'm going to disagree with, I find out what I can agree with a person. And often in our evangelism, we've gone straight to the disagreement. So it's like, okay, no, I agree with you. That's a challenging question. It's a difficult question. And this is how I handle it. So can you see that puts you on a different footing? And you're making a statement that you've had to think this through as well. So the next little thing I then ask linked to that is, could I just ask you a question to help me? Why do you ask that question? Or make that statement, because sometimes it can be made as a statement, can't it? So if somebody says, I believe in a God living in a world of suffering, why do you ask that question? Now, that's a really important thing to ask, because I can guarantee most people who are sharing their faith, if they get asked the suffering question, they'll go straight to the book of Genesis and explain about original sin and God's plan for the world. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. Number one, we tell that narrative as though people understand it. But more and more people are Bible illiterate. So to tell the Genesis narrative as though they know it and understand it, they're going, inside they're going, I don't understand that story. I don't get that. Second thing is, and you may or may not agree with me on this, I really don't mind whether you agree or disagree with me. Okay, what I'm coming to you at today is from a lot of years of experience. Okay, I think to start with explaining about the suffering in the world, to start from the Bible is fine for me, because the Bible's my first and last and ultimate source of authority. But for your average non-believer, it's no source of authority at all. And so I don't just default to an explanation of Genesis. But probably the bigger reason I don't, well, not probably, the bigger reason I don't just start with an academic or theological response to the question is because, let's face it, whilst you may be theologically sound, if the person's asking, how can you believe in a God of love in a world of suffering because just last week their mum died, or they lost their job and they wondered how they're going to feed the children, or they've been moved to tears because of the war in the Ukraine and see the destruction and desolation, going to a theological or academic response to what is an emotionally charged question is going to miss the mark. So that's why I always ask, whatever the question, I always say, that's a really good question, blah, 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 blah. Why do you ask that question? Because then that's going to give me a little bit more clarity on how I need to approach the answer. Does that make sense? So I do quite a lot of dialogue. I do quite a lot of digging, quite a lot of asking questions so that I can get the information. And I was just saying over lunch when we were having a sandwich that I've been to this sports therapist this week, and I went on Friday, and I've had this knee problem for about a year now, and I've had various appointments have been cancelled just because of COVID. Really, it's not a problem. It is what it is. And I finally got a referral. I had an X-ray, and I went in, and my knee's been really painful. I've not been able to walk down steps or any kind of incline. It's been okay on the flat, and even actually walking up, most bizarre. So I went for my physio, and they asked me lots and lots of questions, and then they did most of the consultation. I had to do, it's most bizarre, laid on my bed, holding my iPhone, doing this with your knee and doing that with your knee, and then do it with the other one, and it's been a nightmare. And I finished the conversation, and they said, right, you need to do these exercises. There's a tear in your meniscus, or at least a strain in your meniscus, right? So I Googled meniscus, because you do, and I didn't know what it was. I'm still none the wiser, but anyway, I Googled it. And I'm sharing it with my wife, and my wife said to me, did they ask you to because I've got this weird swelling. My wife said to me, did they ask you to forgive me, to remove your trousers, to show them the issue? I went, no. She said, well, how on earth can they properly diagnose what the situation is? And it was only after she'd said that, I thought, that's a fair point, that really. So anyway, they gave me these exercises, which I did. So this was about 10 days ago, I saw that one. And it made it worse. So on Wednesday and Thursday, I'd been doing the exercises for 4 or 5 days. I stopped because I was in agony. I couldn't even walk on the flat anymore. I was looking like Quasimodo, dragging my leg behind me because I couldn't put any weight bearing on it. And I thought, this is ridiculous. So I went to see this sports therapist, and they asked me loads of questions, and they said, right, let's have a little look. And he said, I was just saying, he said, it's your hamstring. And I said to him, well, no, because the pain's here, and it's going down here. He said, no, it's your hamstring. And so he got me on his couch and started massaging, and inside I was still going, I know you do this for a living, but really? But it's amazing. My legs are almost completely healed after one session. And he was massaging the hamstring and then down the calf. But even when he went down the calf, I'm thinking, it's at the front, you've gone beyond the injury now. But he hit these spots and I thought, oh, I'm cynical now. Oh, that hit something. And then he did the same in the calf. And it's almost like completely healed from one 36-pound sports therapy session. But what I tell you that story because he asked lots and lots and lots of questions. And he looked at the swelling. He ascertained all the information that he needed and then was able to say with confidence, this is what it was. Whereas I'd felt, and I'm not disparaging the NHS, they're under a huge amount of pressure, but I didn't feel they asked all the questions that they needed to ask or do a total investigation so that they could get to the proper cause. And what I love about the sports therapist, I have to do nothing in this. I don't have to do any physio exercises. I mean, come on, who's ever finished a complete course of physio? Maybe anybody? No, okay. So asking questions to get to the issue, I think so important, and get to the real question that they're asking. Because sometimes the question that a person's asking is a presenting question, not the real question. I'll give you a few more examples of that as we kind of navigate through. So that's interesting. Why do you ask that question or make that statement? And the truth is that most questions are what I call untested thinking. Untested thinking. Somebody poses the question, makes the statement because they've heard somebody else say it, but they themselves, or as I alluded to earlier, they haven't heard anybody else with equal authority give an opposing view, so they think it must therefore be true. It must therefore be real. And so they ask their question with an authority that is based on somebody else's authority that they've never heard challenged. And so a lot of the questions that people ask are untested thinking. And so if we can start to test their thinking, which we can do if we work through these things ourselves, then that's where we get a few points. So we do what's called push the question to its logical conclusion. Why? Because not all questions are red herrings. And for some people, the question that they have may well be the one obstacle to them coming to faith. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pause for about 10 minutes to have a hot tasty beverage, grab a bit of fresh air, and then we'll come back and we'll start to look then at how we begin to push those questions to the logical conclusion, how we start to tiptoe into actually dealing with the question that a person asked. I'll stand over by the books in case anybody wants to get them now, but they will be available at the end anyway. So we're just coming up to past. Shall we come back at just coming up to 20 to? Is that all right? Lovely. See you in a few.